technology and official patronage were crucially reliant on census counts of demography, giving birth to new anxieties and new hopes around minor and major languages, often resulting in important political mobilizations and everyday performances of the newly invented identities. Some of these histories also point out the generative, rather than the purely repressive, effects of linguistic standardization. At least in the form we know them to exist, mass literacy and popular education would not have been possible without linguistic standardization. Nationalism's embrace of linguistic identities seems only to have deepened these contradictions, and the arbitrariness of evangelical or colonial standardization was only naturalized with more and renewed vigor in the post-colonial nation-states. It is at this historiographical juncture that we have come to speak of the vernacular archives today. Every archive, as Derrida famously reminds us, perversely combines the impulses of preservation and annihilation. Colonial production of vernacular languages is only one part of the story. There is no getting away from the fact that the statistical instrumental complex of colonialism also sped up the rate of loss in an unparalleled manner. Aboriginal Australia is the most striking example in this regard. At the time of colonization in the late 18th century, it was home to more than 250 distinct languages, some 700 to 800 language varieties, spoken across a population of around 1 million people. In some 2 centuries, only 18 are now being learned by children as their first languages.
Sure.
But there are other, less visible losses too. Entire epistemological universes are fast disappearing under our eyes, even and especially when we treat languages instrumentally. A language is not simply a medium, an instrument, a basket of skills. It is an archive itself. It embodies, performs, and brings into being a whole life world that cannot be reduced to a grammar or a dictionary. Histories of collective experience, structures of cultural memory, and worlds of popular intellectuality lie embedded in everyday use of languages. And yet, to place this archive under the sign of the vernacular, the language of the homebred slave, is to recognize its relational nature, its relative lack of power, its contested paternity, its suspected misogyny, in other words, its constitutive worldliness. To approach the vernacular as an archive is to reject the identitarian demand on language as an undifferentiated domain of otherness, frozen in time. Historians can play a critical role here, unpacking the different layers of historical time compressed into vernacular forms and categories, teasing out the patterns of contact and sociality, the networks of ideas and objects, and eventually locating and re-energizing the dynamism of popular intellection. Of particular importance here are histories of certain vernacular forms and categories which extend back before European colonialism and which are all too often in the present trapped and refigured in colonially derived discourses of tradition. Caroline's keynote address tomorrow, I know, will present a beautiful example of that. For me, meanwhile, the question of vernacular archives opens up to other horizons. On my reading, a vernacular is the promise of full translatability, which necessarily fails itself. It occurs at the moment of translation, when it is forced into an act of exchange. It remains exchangeable to the extent that the master language remains prepared to be shortchanged. How I came to hold on to this observation is what I want to share with you today, with a little self-indulgent account of my own research into a set of stories that I grew up with. But before that, let me show you a map. So that is really, thank you. That circled area is roughly what is called Assam in India, and references to kind of sexual prowess and magical excess of Assamese women were very current, continues to be current, but it was kind of unprecedentedly current for a long time in India, and particularly in Bengal, which is the province where the British capital of Calcutta was situated. And the Bengalis, obviously, you need to know this basic stuff before I tell you the story. So the Bengalis think of themselves as, because they were first to be colonized, that they were more culturally superior and more progressed specimen than the Assamese, who were often seen as the most backward, most primitive, and largely unmapped, even areas even unmapped now, largely unmapped, hilly, mountainous terrain. It was also kind of reputed to be home to different kinds of, magical practices associated with very esoteric and to modern sensibility, very appalling styles of Hinduism. So that the voluptuous and sexually insatiable women in the perilous frontier could, and in many instances actually did, turn male strangers into sheep was a widely shared belief. There are lots of, these are most famous kind of popular depiction in art, but there are lots of stories, and I'll share some of them with you. So the other thing that I must tell you, that during the 19th century, particularly during the last two decades of the 18th century and the first 3 decades of 19th century, British administrators and scholars engaged in a peculiar way of recovering the true authentic tradition from the mythical and epic kind of fables of India. What they did often, they would read names of places in the Sanskrit texts, and those names will be matched against the current names. Often there was no oral resemblance, often it was very elastic etymology, but they would kind of assign a Sanskrit name for all these regions. And Assam's name was determined to be Kamarup. So we'll come to that, because many of these Indic languages, the place names can actually be translated, right? So Kama means desire, lust, and Rup means form, Ananda Rup, right? The form of joy. That's the meaning of his name, right? So the form of lust, form of desire. Obviously, the name itself almost prefigured a story. Now, even today, the colloquial expression Kamrupa's sheep is often kind of used. It continues in the quotidian conversations to excite the image of an enchanted, docile male who is entirely under the control of a seductive woman. The strikingly long career of this expression, wavering between metaphor and literality, is unevenly dispersed across various registers of 19th and 20th century vernacular imagination. So I wanted to write a history of these stories. And how do we do it? There was a problem. Because the stories were many. And I did not know which one was not mine. In the case of Circe, the famous Greek character, who of course will come to mind when we are thinking in terms of a seductive shifter and enchantress. It has been pointed out that the schematic nature of the relevant Odyssey episode takes it for granted that you know a fuller story, of which this is an abbreviated version. I wish we knew what the fuller story was here. Indeed, as I realized after a few months, by the 17th century, a number of cognate tales in the non-Sanskrit narrative networks of different vernaculars along the entire Gangetic Valley, spreading from Punjab in the northwest into Bengal in the east. They were quite current and they were in circulation. But was the fullest story a cumulative aggregate of these tales, or were they versions with no originals? Frankly, it was not possible to determine, particularly because they came to us through a long fractal history of remembrance, textualization, compilation, editing, and translation over at least 3 centuries. Therefore, it is not fruitful, I realized, either to attempt a model of literary evolution as Western scholars on Farsi have done, for example, because the sources were scattered. But there was another difficulty too. What should be taken as the essential and indispensable elements of our stories, without which we will cease to recognize them? Was it the turning into sheep part? Was it the connection between magical charms and erotic might? Was it the mention of the word Kamarupa or its different vernacular figurations like Karu, Kavaru, etc.? The name by which apparently Assam was known in the pre-British textual world of South Asia? Or was it the reference to an exclusive land of women? Right? Not everything was present everywhere. To complicate the matter further, unlike Circe, there was no single figure into which the forces of magic, enchantment, and carnal pleasure could be condemned. Yes, women were often present in these stories, but in some versions, they too disappeared to give the impression that the stories are more about a country of magic and miracles than about the women residing in it. So, at that point, it was quite difficult to to hold on to the regular whipping boy of Indian history, colonialism. Because most of the documents clearly stated that many of these stories were about this magical land where women and others turned people into sheep, were kind of, or asses or bats in some narratives, were also available pretty much before British colonialism. So it's not Anna Clintock's kind of pornotropics, the magic land of colonial frontier where the colonial desire reflects and projects its forbidden sexual desires. But at the same time, it is difficult to kind of keep to the more standard, commonplace, conventional secular explanations, which naggingly insist that these are not completely unparalleled stories. Predominantly male anxieties about a land of women, where men lose their customary position of dominance and life, and live, when they live at all, as slaves or victims of magic, constitute, many would say, almost an anthropological universal. So one trained anthropologist, who actually the only one in the 1930s who gave some attention to these stories, he kind of explained away their peculiarities, citing multiple analogous traditions from areas as varied as Greece, Arabia, New Guinea, and China. While this kind of homespun structuralism still fails to answer the question, why Assam? It can indeed be nicely combined with a more historically sensitive rationalization. One may think of Mary Douglas's classic work, for example, which seeks to demonstrate that the vulnerability of society at their margins is greatest, since the contrast between form and non-form is strikingly visible. So Assam, we are told, was anyway removed from the major theatre of Indian history, and therefore as an unconnected frontier constituted a kind of terra incognita, mirroring the ignorance and psychosis of the neighboring people and states. This is how most of the 19th and 20th century enlightened understanding or explanation of these stories were kind of, this is how they explain. So such explanations, my problem was that such explanations do little more than actually eternalizing the issue of Assam's peripheral marginality. Moreover, as I said, no place is born a frontier. Moreover, it hypostatizes anxiety, undefined worries. Worries of what? Of a sedentary population, of a self-conscious masculinity, of a sterilized state. They seem to be the only running thread connecting these diverse stories dispersed in time and space. How can we think of a history of that anxiety which keeps itself impervious to the multiple historical practices? One of the more articulate samples of these pre-colonial narratives came from colonial administrator Briggs' kind of recording of a particular yogi, Gorakhnath, this is one of the, I'm not going to read it out, but you can look at it, where he basically, and there are 17, 18 other versions which have been able to locate, not all from the same sect, but different ascetic masculine sects, where the stories often, obviously the names change, it's a different guru for each sect, and different places are mentioned, but often the remarkable similarity in these 17, 18 texts is that it is often the magic actually comes, what in English we call magic, actually comes from the attainment of yogic power of a certain guru or a certain sage, right? And it is often the women who are the victims of this magic, as you can kind of see in this quote. Now, this is, I'm not going to kind of repeat the examples, I have many more, but the standard, kind of the most common version is that there was a land of women where there was a queen and a yogi went there, defined all norms of ascetic masculinity, actually got into erotic dalliances, and then therefore, lost a drop of his semen, which basically created a son in a land of women, and eventually the yogi kind of was humiliated, and in another version he was rescued by his guru and so on. So it is not really a whimper of anxiety, but the laughter of mastery that organizes these narratives. The Karu, Kauru or Kavaru women, as different manuscripts kind of name this place, are certainly in possession of some supernatural powers. They turn the guru's disciples into animals, but that power exists only in a subordinate relation to the overpowering might of the gurus. And it is not exclusively feminine. So the male gurus are often kind of, doing the same tricks. So that's kind of, we get a rough window of these 16th, 17th century tales. And then can we skip, for example, kind of bring all that to another kind of description. In the 19th century, among an aboriginal tribe, a missionary noted, sorry, I don't have the quote here, but I'll have to read out. He says, the Kamaru country is very rich and fertile, and there are only women living there, or else the women predominate, and no one is able to go there and stay. Another report is that there are men who, but they are not liked by the women. Definite reasons that cannot be recorded are given. Once a Santhal, and Santhal is a particular aboriginal category used for a population which was also forced to work in Assam for tea gardens, was caught by a woman. He told that he had come to learn their science and was kept for 5 years by the Kamaru woman, who during daytime had him covered by a large bamboo basket and instructed him during the night. At last, he got his science. The woman turned him into a kite and he flew back into his own country. And similar stories. The painful gathering of a belongingness disrupted by programmed migration is only too evident in these stories. Even Bodin noticed how in these stories the experience of many living Santals who had been in Assam as laborers in tea gardens and otherwise, was contributing to the tales current about the Kamru country. Now, even the most literalist analyst couldn't say that the yogis of the 17th century returned as the immigrant Santhal of the 19th century. It is, if there is an anxiety here, it is more about being deprived than about over-consuming. The point I'm trying to make, rather than going into the detail, let me summarize. The point that I'm trying to make is that the historicist imagination of the 19th century encouraged a lot of scholars to bring certain questions to the vernacular records and vernacular narratives. Questions which were not previously posed to these records. Right? So now, the historicist imagination demanded that give us the truth about this country, about the people, give us truths, give us information. Right? That's what they were asking all these popular stories, popular tales, where people turn into sheep or kite or they travel, right? The interesting thing to notice is that many of these vernacular narratives mention a lot of places. So some of these names are familiar and locatable on the map. Something like a place called Delhi, right? It's known to be a city. Then there would be in the same paragraph, there might be a place which would be a place called, let's say, Actenia, which means one-legged, country of the one-legged, country of the horse-faced, right? So incredulous spaces for the scholar. And the scholars wanted to determine for each text what is the level or hierarchy of credibility. Which one should I take as valuable information and can be historicized, and which one is pure fantasy. And this was particularly complicated by the fact that in these languages, all these names had meanings. Right? So therefore, some chose to translate particular names into what it means and tried to draw inference from there. Some chose not to translate those names and tried to find oral kind of semblance with other places. The run of the kind of, let me read out a little bit here. So this administrator who wrote about these stories, he said that they are mixing up territories. He wrote this line, that they are mixing up present, actual, real territories with mythic, fabulous places, and translated into the new language of histories. The old textual geographies energized interesting dynamics. On the one hand, right, the ambiguous line between the geographies experienced from the geographies tabled not only confounded the colonial ethnographer, it produced contestation over the very spatial strategy along which the whole edifice of Indian history was erected. By the beginning of the 20th century, place name identification was considered a major, almost foundational step towards constructing an authentic history of India and its regions. Experts, writing usually in English, started publishing thickly footnoted volumes to prove or disprove particular identifications of locations mentioned in the pre-colonial Sanskrit text with existing localities on the British Indian map. Right? So, earlier, the name of a city, which is mentioned, take the most ominous example in India today, Ayodhya, right? Name of a city of a capital over which huge communal tension has broken out. Now, in Thailand, you got an Ayodhya. In several other parts of India, you have multiple claims that these are the Ayodhyas. And as long as these narratives could organize in a non-national world, then their own capacity, there was no problem with this. But now, with the historicist imagination, there has to be only one Ayodhya, one Ganga, one Mount Meru, and so on and so forth. So, this structure, therefore, the scope of local responses to some extent, at least among a section of the educated middle class. the increasing access to print and the unpretentious dependence of etymology on oral semblances encouraged many a local, educated, well-versed in village and district traditions and broadly acquainted with the identificatory methodology of Indology to debate and discuss the possible locations of a scripted territory. Because of the Orientalist intervention in India, the pride, the esteem was to find a Sanskritic tradition, because that would prove we are Aryans, right? That was the other missing half of the Indian national thought. So the promise of earning a place of repute for one's own locality, that can be a village, a region, a province, a district, in the national tradition, seemed even more tempting to this middle class. Diverse traditions were mobilized, pitted against one another, and with a little help from flexible etymology, contenders often passionately tried to inscribe their preferred places into the organic core of the nation space. The remarkable sense of urgency and angst that animated many of the vernacular histories in colonial Assam over this issue appears particularly sharp in the context of Assam's belated emergence in the map of British India, and the lack of what the historians perceived as a clear Aryan ancestry. It was in this context that the Sanskrit references to Kamarupa were taken as Assam's passport to the eternal space of the essential nation. Working through the scattered references in the Sanskrit text, the early historians of Assam tried to negotiate a certain kind of coherence that was not available otherwise. So the classicized places, the familiar places, and the incredible places followed each other in a rapid succession, which was at base confusing to the historicist. Which of the names were transparent and which others were not? Which place names should be translated and etymologically reduced to produce a historically defensible meaning? And which place names should be treated as proper names, as inalienable and non-transferable properties of the nation? In 1922, a historian tried to find from a particular name, the name of the one-legged country. Then it's called Ethenia, and he found a place in Burma called Ethena. And then he said that this is the same place. Earlier we had a big kingdom, it expanded into Burma, so this is a clear proof, right? So that kind of stuff. While another person from another province who was very skeptical of such claims, he said, no, this is mere mythology, and this is obviously not part of history. So the entire debate, in a way, turned around what regime of questions and assumptions the scholars were bringing to the domain of the vernacular. Right? And that's where the relationality question for me becomes kind of important. Now, how much time do I have? 10 minutes? So, I just wanted to show you how all these changes over the 19th and 20th century, because as now there's a particular paradox that I find very interesting. So on the one hand, there is a literalist drive, right? That the name of Kamru or any version of that, even if it is remotely kind of resemblant, then that name was held on to as a pure proof of the historicity of this place, right? So the geographical demand was fueled by a certain kind of literalist reading. But the more that happened, as more and more historians, even professional historians, began to kind of take these names as the real literal expression, the more the stories had to be allegorized, right? Because no one could now in their right mind actually think that a man or a woman turned someone else into sheep or bats, right? So increasingly now, this dual tension, on the one hand, the literalist search for a locus of tradition, for a ground of authenticity, and on the other hand, the constant allegorization of these stories into some kind of new moral metaphysical message. These kind of defined in the way these were done. And obviously, much of this was framed by colonial anthropology. So this is one of the kind of very famous comments on the Assamese women, where the colonial administrators are taking note of the local legend and also saying that unfortunately their morality is at a very low way. So they are more beautiful than other Indian women, but it is a very common thing for them to break the bond of celibacy. So this particular kind of, this closed economy of etymology and anthropology, where one set of data could only relentlessly refer back to the other, the new discursive regime fastens the forms of magic and immorality in the figure of the Assamese women. Right. So now, if you look at this, this is from a novel, a popular novel in the vernacular of Bengali. I've translated it for you, where two characters are in Assam and they are talking about the problem. Right? So one guy asks his friend that, isn't this the country of the witches? So all the women here are witches. That's what we hear in our country. But I haven't seen a single witch here. This is the time when a rail line has been established to Assam. Pilgrims are actually going. It's written like 15 years after that. Right? So now a new reality has to be faced, and these stories have to be explained. So look at the last paragraph, where the author, who is obviously the more all-knowing person in this conversation, he explains that there can be, a different kind of explanation. So here, loyal wives are very few in numbers. The married women as well as the widows indulge in adultery. Most probably, it is true that these licentious women try to trap the good-looking men among the pilgrims, and that is what the ship story is about. Right? So this fascination about it. This is one of the first detective stories. It's published in 1896 in Bengali, and this is a detective who wears Indian clothes but smokes cheroot and carries a pistol. He faces his arch nemesis is this Assamese woman, right, who is described here. So this is the final kind of climax of this very popular detective story in 1896. So she describes that she's from a particular place, a place which actually where two brutal expeditions by this time have been sent to burn, and so he's writing in the name is in the newspaper, Mishmi. So that Mishmi expeditions, punitive expeditions, under that sign, he's writing. And look at Jumelia, the famous Vamp's response. Women from our country don't sag at the age of 20, as the women from your country do. Our women know how to preserve their youth forever. If you get to see me even after 10 years, you'll find me the same, this callow face like a green palm fruit, this pleasant sweet voice, this playful stare in my eyes, the seductive smile on these red rosy lips, the golden color, she's speaking about herself, remember? Golden color of skin, everything will remain the same, right? We know medicines, magic medicines, right? So now it is kind of really interesting to see that it is too easy to read this extract as a conversation between a male detective and a female criminal, between rationality and magic, between metropolis and frontier, framed quite significantly in a situation of confession before forced death. Let us be a little attentive not only to the fantasies and fears about an abnormal land of eternal youth, but also the curious mishmash of geographies, whereby the women of a community pushed beyond the Indian jurisdictional line were invested with the traditional magical attributes of the Sanskritic territory of Kamarupa. Writing in the shadow of the violent massacres of the Mishmi villages, the story writer, whose epigrams in this book came from the canonical texts of Shakespeare, Dodge, Byron, and Lytton, who was creatively fusing the imperial codes of criminality and eroticity on a new register of Kamarupa. The inflections of new concerns and sensibilities that entered the stories by the middle of the 19th century were related to the contemporary growth of the so-called fake tantras in Calcutta. Right? So now, many of the, I don't know if I have this, I have a lot of handbills actually, where they would state these stories and say that this is a way to charm your man. And it is from Kamruk, it is from Assam, and that particular amulet or that particular thing is with us. Write to us, send us a mail order, we will send you the stuff. So market of the mysterious is also developing, right? And some of these tantras actually write their mantras not only in Sanskrit, as the mantras usually are, but takes Assamese, Bengali, Hindi, in some cases even English and Urdu words into the mantras, and these are all charming mantras, right? So that's a huge market, even now. Now this is kind of, there are many more, but look at this. This is a early 20th century, a major, in Presidency College, one of the most enlightened institutions of Calcutta. This is what they were talking about in the hostel, where actually people were scared of their Assamese hostel mates if they know so much magic that they could turn them into sheep. Right? So this fear and stereotype is actually quite popular in it's not simply a fictive representation, it affects kind of everyday engagement. Then there are all kinds of philosophies and philosophers come up with, so here is a classic kind of philosophization where they say that this is basically kind of a metaphysical theory about these stories. Now, here is someone who actually in the 20th century was the chief of the Theosophist Society, who gave a Theosophist explanation of the stuff, right? So, what I'm trying to say, and eventually, this is before, I'll end with this. This is 1920. The Indian National Congress is really kind of, divided. And Gandhi is trying to kind of actually hold together the divergent sections, and the Congress is falling apart. And then Gandhi's lieutenant, and this is a National Congress session happening in Assam. So in the welcoming address, he says that, so it's a different quality of the sheep that is now being invoked. That the sheep follows the leader faithfully, right? So here, now, the nationalist discipline has actually kind of entered the disciplinary imagination of imperial history, right? So where do we locate the vernacular? Right? In all these different moments, all the different questions that we bring to these records and demand different kind of answers. Everybody was satisfied that they explained the stories rightly. The theosophist, the philosopher, the person who was selling handbill, the detective novel writer, everybody thought that they got the real authentic meaning of the vernacular. And maybe each of them did, because the vernacular exists exactly in this unequal relation of forced exchange. That's all I want.
Oh.